The Temple of Forgotten Echoes. Deep in the mountains, where clouds gather like thoughts before meditation, there stood a temple that existed between moments. The monks who lived there had discovered something extraordinary about silence, that within it lived the echoes of every prayer ever whispered, every breath ever drawn in contemplation, every tear shed in surrender. Brother Kenshin arrived at this temple on a morning when the world seemed to hold its breath. He had wandered for 7 years, carrying with him a question that had grown heavier with each step. Why did his meditation feel empty when his heart was so full of seeking? The abbot, a woman whose age seemed to shift like shadows, welcomed him with eyes that held the depth of still water. "You have come to learn about echoes," she said, though Kenshin had spoken no words of his purpose. "But first, you must understand what creates them." The temple's daily rhythm was unlike any Kenshin had known. The monks did not chant at sunrise. Instead, they listened. They sat in the great hall, where the walls were carved with symbols that seemed to move in peripheral vision, and they opened themselves to receive what the silence offered. At first, Kenshin heard nothing but the ordinary sounds of breathing, the settling of wood, the distant cry of mountain birds. But as days passed, something began to change. In the depths of meditation, he started to perceive whispers that weren't quite voices, melodies that weren't quite music. The abbot explained that the temple had been built on a place where sound behaved differently, where the earth itself had learned to remember. "Every word spoken in genuine seeking," she said, "leaves an impression, not in the air, which forgets quickly, but in the space between breaths, in the pause between thoughts. This temple catches those impressions like a net catches morning dew." Kenshin learned that the echoes were not random. They responded to the sincere heart offering guidance to those who had lost their way. A young monk struggling with doubt might hear the faint echo of an ancient master's teaching on faith. Someone grieving might catch the whisper of a prayer for acceptance spoken centuries ago by another who had walked the same path of loss. One evening, as Kenshin sat in meditation, he heard his own voice echoing back to him, not from the present moment, but from a meditation 7 years ago, on the day he had first decided to seek answers. His younger self was asking the universe why peace felt so elusive, why every spiritual practice seemed to lead him further from contentment rather than closer to it. And then, like a gentle wave washing over sand, came the echo of his own future voice, patient, compassionate, already knowing what his past self was yet to learn. "Peace was never elusive," the echo whispered. "You were simply listening for it in tomorrow instead of feeling it in this breath." The revelation was so simple it brought tears to his eyes. All his seeking, all his wandering had been necessary, not to find something new, but to return to what was always present. The emptiness he had felt in meditation wasn't a lack. It was the spaciousness in which all experience arose and passed away. As weeks turned to months, Kenshin discovered that he too was beginning to create echoes that others could hear. His presence in meditation seemed to strengthen the temple's ability to hold and share these whispered wisdoms. The abbot smiled when she saw this development. "You understand now," she said. "The temple doesn't create echoes. We do. Every time we meditate with genuine intention, every time we seek truth without grasping, we add our voice to the eternal conversation. The temple simply remembers and offers back what we need to hear when we're ready to listen." Kenshin remained at the temple for 3 more seasons, learning not just to hear the echoes, but to contribute to them consciously. He discovered that his question Why meditation felt empty when his heart was full of seeking contained its own answer. The fullness of seeking was itself a form of grasping, and only when he could sit with complete contentment in the emptiness did the fullness reveal itself as peace. When he finally left the temple, Kenshin carried with him not answers, but a quality of listening that transformed every moment into a potential echo. He walked down the mountain path, knowing that somewhere in some temple of the heart, his footsteps were creating whispers that would guide future seekers to remember what they had never truly forgotten. The temple continued its eternal practice, collecting the echoes of all who sought truth, holding them like precious pearls of wisdom, until the moment when another seeking heart would need to hear exactly that whisper of encouragement, exactly that breath of understanding, exactly that echo of their own deepest knowing reflected back to them from the silence that holds all sounds. The monk who collected silence in a monastery that existed at the edge of two valleys, where wind patterns created unusual acoustic phenomena, lived a monk named June, who had developed the most peculiar practice. While his brothers collected scriptures, medicinal herbs, or works of calligraphy, June collected silence. Not the absence of sound, but silence itself, as if it were a tangible substance that could be gathered, preserved, and shared. June had not always been a collector of silence. In his youth, he had been a musician of considerable talent, his flute performances drawing audiences from distant provinces. But during a particularly demanding concert, something extraordinary occurred. In the pause between two notes, he heard something that changed the course of his life entirely. Within that brief silence lived a quality of peace so profound that the music itself seemed crude by comparison. From that moment, Jiun began to notice silence everywhere. Not just the obvious silences between words or music, but the micro-silences that existed between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the flutter of butterfly wings. He discovered that these silences were not empty spaces, but were filled with a presence that spoke more eloquently than any sound. When he entered the monastery, his fellow monks were initially puzzled by his unusual dedication. While they sat in meditation seeking enlightenment through concentration or mindfulness, June sat seeking silence through a practice he had developed himself. He would position himself in different locations throughout the monastery grounds, learning to distinguish between various qualities of silence. The silence in the prayer hall carried the weight of centuries of devotion. It was dense, rich, almost burgundy in character, if silence could have color. The silence of the garden at Dawncan was entirely different, light, fresh, with an almost crystalline quality that seemed to amplify rather than muffle the world's subtle sounds. The silence of the library was scholarly patient, as if it had absorbed the wisdom of countless texts and now radiated understanding. Brother Jiun developed an intricate system for categorizing his collection. He created mental containers for different types of silence, learning to recognize their unique signatures the way a wine master distinguishes vintages. There was the profound silence that followed the moment of understanding in meditation. There was the anticipatory silence before the first light of dawn. There was the grief-touched silence that lingered in spaces where loss had been deeply felt. The other monks gradually began to notice that spaces where June had practiced his silence collection seemed to possess an unusual quality of peace. The meditation hall, after one of his sessions, would hold a deeper stillness that made their own practice more effortless. Conversations in the tea room after his presence there seemed to flow with greater wisdom and less unnecessary chatter. One winter evening, a delegation of scholars arrived at the monastery, fleeing a conflict in their homeland. They carried with them precious manuscripts, but also deep trauma from witnessing their library's destruction. The scholars were agitated, unable to sleep or concentrate, their minds caught in endless loops of worry and grief. The abbot asked June if his practice might offer any assistance. June spent 3 days preparing for what he privately called a great sharing. He moved through the monastery, collecting the finest silences he could perceive. From the meditation hall, he gathered the silence of deep concentration. From the infirmary, he collected the silence of healing and surrender. From the memorial garden, he found the silence of honored memory that transformed grief into reverence. On the 4th evening, June invited the scholars to join him in the main hall. He did not speak or instruct them in any technique. Instead, he began to release the silences he had collected, allowing them to fill the space like an invisible incense that touched the mind rather than the nose. The scholars, without understanding what was happening, began to feel their agitation subside. Their breathing naturally deepened. The harsh edges of their thoughts grew softer. One by one, they found themselves settling into a peace they had not experienced since before their trauma. The silence June shared carried within it the accumulated wisdom of the monastery. Generations of monks who had found tranquility in the face of impermanence, who had learned to hold loss without being destroyed by it. The eldest scholar, a man whose hair had gone white from stress rather than age, began to weep quietly. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of recognition, as if he was remembering something precious he thought he had lost forever. Later, he would tell others that in that moment he remembered what it felt like to be at peace with uncertainty, to rest in the space between thoughts rather than being carried away by their urgency. As word of this evening spread, other visitors began to seek out Brother June, not for teaching or guidance in the conventional sense, but simply to sit in the presence of his collected silences. He never spoke of his practice directly, never claimed to be doing anything special. He simply sat, and somehow the quality of silence that surrounded him invited others into their own deepest stillness. Years passed, and June's collection grew ever more refined. He learned to perceive silences that existed within sounds themselves. The silence at the heart of a bird's song, the silence that gave shape to spoken words, the silence that lived within music and made melody possible. His practice became a form of meditation that taught others not through instruction but through presence. On his last day at the monastery, before setting out on a pilgrimage that would take him to new places where different silences waited to be discovered, June performed his final sharing. Every monk gathered in the main hall, and for 1 hour he released all the silences he had collected over decades of practice. The experience was described differently by each person present, but all agreed on its essential quality. It was like being held by the peace that exists at the foundation of all existence, the silence from which all sounds arise and to which they return. In that hour, the distinction between inner and outer silence dissolved completely, and each monk experienced directly what June had spent his life learning to perceive and share. After June left the monastery, maintained a new tradition. Each evening, the monks would sit together and practice what they called silence sitting, not seeking to create silence, but learning to recognize and appreciate the silence that was always present, waiting to be acknowledged. They discovered that June's greatest gift had not been his collection itself, but his demonstration that silence was not something rare or difficult to find. It was the background upon which all experience danced as available and nourishing as breath itself. The path June walked led him through many lands, and in each place he found new varieties of silence to discover and share. But perhaps his greatest teaching was the simplest, that in learning to truly listen to silence, one learns to hear the peace that never comes and goes, but simply is always present, always available, always ready to welcome anyone who remembers to pause and listen for what was never absent. The garden, where time blooms backwards. In the remote highlands, where mist clung to ancient terraces, like memories refusing to fade, there existed a garden that defied the natural order of temporal flow. Master Yuki had discovered this place during her 40th year of wandering, when grief over her teacher's passing had driven her to seek solitude in the furthest reaches of the mountain wilderness. The garden appeared ordinary at first glance. Stone pathways wound between carefully tended beds of flowers, herbs, and vegetables that any monastery might cultivate. But as Yuki spent her first evening there, she began to notice peculiarities that challenged everything she understood about the passage of time. The cherry blossoms she had seen in full bloom at sunset were tight buds at dawn. The vegetables she harvested for her simple meal had somehow returned to their plants by the following morning. Initially, Yuki attributed these observations to exhaustion from her journey, or perhaps to the altitude affecting her perception. But as days passed, the phenomenon became undeniable. This garden existed in a state of temporal reversal, where effects preceded causes, where autumn leaves fell upward to rejoin their branches, where seeds emerged from fully grown plants to return to their packets. The discovery might have unsettled a mind less prepared by years of meditation practice. But Yuki had long ago learned to observe without immediately judging, to witness without demanding explanation. She settled into the small hermitage that sat at the garden's heart, a simple structure that seemed as affected by the temporal anomaly as everything else around it. Each morning, Yuki would find her meditation cushion exactly as she had left it the evening before, despite having spent the night sleeping elsewhere. Her journals, which she filled with observations each day, would be blank again by sunrise, as if the insights she had recorded were flowing backward into the realm of potential rather than remaining fixed as past experience. At first, this reversal frustrated her scholarly mind, which had been trained to accumulate knowledge to build understanding upon previous learning. But gradually, she began to appreciate the profound teaching embedded in this temporal paradox. Without the ability to cling to yesterday's insights, she was forced to encounter each moment with complete freshness, approaching every meditation as if for the first time. The garden became her teacher in ways no human master ever could. By observing plants that aged backward, watching flowers that closed at sunrise and opened at dusk, she began to understand something fundamental about the nature of impermanence. The conventional view of time, past flowing into present, flowing into future, revealed itself as merely one possible perspective among many. Yuki discovered that her own aging seemed affected by the garden's temporal field. The lines around her eyes, earned through decades of squinting at ancient texts, began to fade. Her hair, which had been turning silver, darkened to its original black. But more significantly, her mind was growing younger too, not in the sense of becoming naive or forgetting hard-won wisdom, but in recovering the sense of wonder and possibility that years of spiritual seeking had gradually worn away. One evening, as she sat watching a butterfly fly backward through the air, landing on flowers that had not yet opened to receive it, Yuki experienced a profound shift in understanding. The butterfly was not flying backward at all. She had simply been conditioned to perceive one direction of movement as forward and its opposite as backward. But from the perspective of pure awareness, both directions were equally valid, equally natural. This realization transformed her meditation practice entirely. Instead of sitting to achieve some future state of enlightenment, she began sitting to discover what was already present, but flowing in a direction her conditioned mind couldn't normally perceive. Instead of seeking to transcend her current experience, she learned to recognize that transcendence was the natural backward flow of consciousness toward its source. The garden taught her about the illusion of spiritual progress. Every tradition spoke of advancement along a path of stages to be achieved, of higher states to be attained. But here, where her recorded insights disappeared each night, where her meditation experiences never accumulated into a sense of achievement, she discovered that the very notion of spiritual progress was itself a form of temporal illusion. True awakening, she realized, was not something that occurred at the end of a long journey of development. It was the recognition that consciousness had never actually moved away from its natural state. It only appeared to have done so when viewed from within the illusion of forward-flowing time. Enlightenment was not an achievement but a remembering, not a gaining but a returning. As seasons passed, or perhaps unpassed, Yuki's presence in the garden began to stabilize its temporal anomalies. Her deep acceptance of the backward flow seemed to create pockets of normal time where visitors could rest without being completely disoriented. Word spread among the spiritual communities of the region about the hermit who had learned to live comfortably in yesterday while dwelling peacefully in tomorrow. Seekers began to arrive, though many found the experience too unsettling to remain for long. Those who stayed learned to release their attachment to linear causation, to logical sequence, to the comforting illusion that spiritual practice was a matter of accumulating insights and techniques. Instead, they learned to rest in the eternal present that existed outside of time's apparent direction entirely. Yuki never taught in the conventional sense. How could she, when any words she spoke would unspeak themselves before dawn? Instead, she demonstrated through her presence that it was possible to live in complete harmony with paradox, to find perfect peace in the dissolution of everything the mind thought it knew about how reality was supposed to function. Her final teaching came not through words, but through disappearance. One morning, the visiting seekers found the garden empty, though Yuki's presence could still be felt in every backward blooming flower, every unseeded plant, every moment that flowed like a river returning to its mountain source. She had not died in any conventional sense, but had learned to flow backward through time until she reached the moment before birth, before the illusion of separation had ever seemed to begin. The garden continues its temporal reversal, offering the same teaching to any who can remain present with impossible paradox long enough to discover that time itself is merely consciousness, exploring all possible directions of movement simultaneously. Those who visit learn that the path to enlightenment is not forward into some improved future state, but backward into the recognition of what was never absent, never needed to be found, never required any journey at all to be completely, perfectly present. The ferryman of midnight dreams. At the confluence of 3 rivers, where moonlight created silver pathways across dark waters, an ancient ferryman named Tenzo guided travelers between the realm of waking consciousness and the borderlands of sleep. His boat moved without oars, propelled by currents that flowed not through water, but through the subtle streams of human awareness as it shifted between states of being. Tenzo had not always been a ferryman of dreams. In his youth, he had served as a meditation teacher in a prestigious monastery renowned for his ability to guide students through the intricate landscapes of consciousness. But a profound experience during his 50th year had transformed his understanding of where true teaching occurred. He discovered that the moments of transition between waking and sleeping held wisdom that daylight meditation could never access. The revelation came during a period of intense retreat when exhaustion had blurred the boundaries of his usual awareness. As he drifted towards sleep one evening, Tenzo found himself conscious within the transition itself, able to observe the mysterious process by which the mind released its grip on ordinary reality and opened to something far more vast and mysterious. In that liminal space, he encountered beings who existed primarily in dream states. Not the symbolic figures of personal psychology, but conscious entities who inhabited the realm between thoughts, between heartbeats, between the moments when one breath ended and the next began. These beings taught him that sleep was not simply rest for the body, but a journey that consciousness took each night to remember its true nature. When Tenzo emerged from his retreat, he could no longer teach meditation in conventional ways. How could he speak of enlightenment as something to be achieved through effort when he had discovered that every night, without any practice at all, consciousness effortlessly returned to its unlimited state? How could he encourage students to seek extraordinary experiences when the most extraordinary experience was freely given each time they surrendered to sleep? He left the monastery and found his way to the confluence where the three rivers created natural pools of stillness amidst their flowing convergence. There he constructed a simple raft and began his practice as a dream ferryman, offering passage to those who had lost their way in the territories between waking and sleeping. His passengers were varied and unusual. Some were insomniacs, whose fear of sleep had created such resistance that they could no longer find the natural doorway into rest. Others were dreamers who had become lost in their own subconscious landscapes, unable to find their way back to ordinary awareness. Still others were spiritual seekers who had heard rumors of the wisdom available in liminal states, but lacked the skill to navigate those subtle realms safely. Tenzo's method was unlike any conventional teaching. He would invite travelers onto his boat as the sun set, guiding them to lie on soft cushions while he began to pole slowly through the converging waters. As the boat moved, he would speak in a voice that grew softer and softer, weaving words that seemed to dissolve the boundaries between speaker and listener, between the sound of water and the sound of breath. His words were not instructions or philosophy, but something more like verbal lullabies that helped consciousness relax its usual patterns of control. He spoke of rivers that flowed upward towards stars, of fish that swam through air, of forests where trees grew downward into earth that was actually sky. His stories made no logical sense, but they created a kind of cognitive softness that allowed the mind to release its insistence on rational coherence. As passengers drifted into the space between waking and sleeping, Tenzo would guide their awareness through the transition with remarkable skill. He had learned to perceive the precise moment when ordinary consciousness began to dissolve, and he would speak directly to that moment, helping travelers remain aware as they passed through the doorway that most people crossed unconsciously. In this state, passengers experienced revelations that transformed their understanding of consciousness itself. They discovered that what they normally considered self was simply a temporary pattern of awareness, like a whirlpool in a river that appeared solid but was actually just water moving in a particular way. They experienced directly that their deepest identity was not the personal mind, but the awareness in which all mental activity arose. One evening, a scholar arrived who had spent 40 years studying Buddhist philosophy, but had never experienced the states that the texts described. His intellectual knowledge was vast, but his direct experience remained limited to ordinary waking consciousness. As Tenzo's boat carried him through the liminal waters, the scholar finally understood what the ancient masters meant when they spoke of emptiness, interdependence, and the illusory nature of separate selfhood. The scholar's transformation was so profound that he remained at the confluence for several months, learning to navigate the dream realms himself. He discovered that every philosophical concept he had studied for decades was actually a map of territories that could be directly explored in the space between waking and sleeping. The texts had not been describing abstract ideas but actual landscapes of consciousness. Another passenger was a mother whose grief over her child's death had created such anguish that sleep brought only nightmares. Tenzo guided her to a place in the dream realm where she could meet her child's consciousness, directly discovering that death was simply another transition like the one between waking and sleeping. Her child's awareness had not been destroyed, but had simply returned to the vast space from which all individual consciousness temporarily emerges. As years passed, Tenzo became a legend among those who sought wisdom in unconventional places. Travelers would journey for months to reach the confluence, hoping for passage on his dream ferry. But he never advertised his services or sought recognition. He simply maintained his presence at the water's edge, available to anyone whose seeking had brought them to question the boundaries between different states of consciousness. The most profound teaching Tenzo offered was his demonstration that enlightenment was not a rare achievement, but a nightly experience that everyone had already mastered. Every person who slept successfully navigated the dissolution of ego consciousness and merged with undifferentiated awareness. The tragedy was not that people were unenlightened, but that they had forgotten to recognize the enlightenment they experienced every night. His final journey came on a night when the three rivers were flowing with unusual luminosity, as if moonlight had become liquid and was moving through the water itself. Tenzo loaded his boat with no passengers, but spoke throughout the night to invisible listeners, sharing teachings that seemed directed toward future seekers who had not yet arrived. As dawn approached, his voice grew softer until it merged completely with the sound of flowing water. Those who witnessed his departure said that Tenzo did not die, but simply continued his journey into deeper realms, becoming a permanent resident of the borderlands he had spent his life exploring. His boat was found empty, but still moving, carried by currents that seemed to respond to intentions rather than physical forces. The confluence continues to attract seekers who have heard stories of the dream ferryman. Some claim they can still see his boat in peripheral vision, especially during the moments when consciousness is shifting between states. Others report hearing his voice in the sound of water flowing over rocks, still offering guidance to anyone who has the courage to question the apparent solidity of waking awareness and explore the vast territories that open each night when the mind finally agrees to let go of its daytime certainties and surrender to the mysterious wisdom of sleep. The library of unspoken prayers beyond the last village. Before the desert begins, where sand meets ancient stone and silence holds conversations with eternity, stood a library unlike any other in the world. The keeper, known only as Sister Amara, tended to collections that existed not in books or scrolls, but in the spaces between words, in the pauses between breaths, in the eternal moment before a prayer finds its voice. This library had been discovered rather than built, emerging from the earth during an earthquake that split open a hillside to reveal chambers that seemed to have been waiting for centuries to be found. The walls were lined with empty shelves that hummed with invisible presence, and the air itself seemed thick with unuttered devotions, hopes that had never found language and supplications too deep for words. Sister Amara had arrived as a young scholar, fleeing the destruction of her monastery's conventional library, carrying with her only a handful of rescued texts and a heart heavy with the loss of accumulated wisdom. But as she explored the strange chambers of this discovered library, she realized that no wisdom had truly been lost. It had simply transformed from written word into something more fundamental and permanent. The first unspoken prayer she learned to perceive was her own, a wordless plea for understanding that had lived in her heart since childhood, too vast and formless to ever be captured in language. In the library's unique atmosphere, this prayer became visible to her inner sight as a shimmering presence that moved through the air like aurora, beautiful beyond description, yet utterly familiar. As days passed, Sister Amara discovered that the library contained the unspoken prayers of countless beings throughout history. Mothers whose love for their children was too immense for words had left traces that still glowed in certain corners. Warriors facing death had deposited their unnamed fears and hopes in chambers that resonated with courage and vulnerability combined. Children who had wished on stars without knowing how to articulate their deepest longings had filled entire rooms with innocence that sparkled like cosmic dust. The organization of this collection required skills that no conventional librarian possessed. Sister Amara learned to categorize prayers not by subject or origin, but by the quality of sincerity that had created them. The deepest, most authentic prayers settled in the library's lower levels, while superficial requests and habitual recitations remained near the surface, eventually dissolving back into the everyday consciousness from which they had emerged. She discovered that certain unspoken prayers possessed remarkable healing properties. Veterans of wars who had never been able to speak of their experiences would find relief in chambers where other soldiers had deposited their wordless understanding of suffering and survival. Mourners who could not voice their grief would discover solace among the unuttered lamentations of countless others who had walked the same path of loss. The library's most precious collection existed in a chamber that Sister Amara called the Repository of Perfect Gratitude. Here lived the prayers of beings who had experienced such overwhelming appreciation for existence itself that language had proved completely inadequate. These prayers radiated a joy so pure that spending even minutes in their presence could transform a visitor's entire relationship with life. One winter, a delegation of scholars arrived from a distant university investigating reports of this unusual library for an academic paper on religious phenomena. Sister Amara welcomed them, but warned that their methods of study would need to be different here. These prayers could not be analyzed or catalogued in conventional ways. They could only be received with the same quality of openness that had originally created them. The lead scholar, Dr. Chen, was initially skeptical of claims about invisible prayers and mystical collections. But as Sister Amara guided the delegation through the chambers, Dr. Chen began to experience something that challenged his materialist worldview. In a room dedicated to the unspoken prayers of scientists and philosophers, he encountered his own deepest questions about the nature of consciousness and reality. Questions he had never dared voice even to himself. These questions, he realized, were themselves a form of prayer, not requests for external intervention, but expressions of the human soul's longing to understand its place in the cosmic order. The library had somehow preserved not just the questions themselves, but the pure wondering that had generated them, the childlike amazement at existence that most adults learn to suppress. Dr. Chen remained at the library for 3 months, learning to perceive and work with unspoken prayers. His colleagues returned to their university with reports that were dismissed as academic fantasy, but Dr. Chen's transformation was too profound to deny. He had discovered that his lifelong pursuit of knowledge was actually a form of devotional practice, and that every genuine question was a prayer to the mystery that underlies all phenomena. Sister Amara's most challenging work involved prayers that had become stuck or distorted. Sometimes people would arrive carrying prayers that had calcified into obsessions or demands no longer flowing with the natural humility that characterized authentic spiritual longing. These visitors required careful guidance to help their prayers return to their original fluidity and grace. The process involved teaching people to release their attachment to specific outcomes while maintaining the essential energy of their spiritual seeking. A parent whose prayer for a child's success had become anxious manipulation learned to transform that energy into a blessing that honored the child's own journey. A seeker whose prayer for enlightenment had become spiritual ambition discovered how to offer that same devotional energy as simple appreciation for whatever arose. As decades passed, Sister Amara became legendary among those who understood that the most profound spiritual communication often occurred without words. Mystics from various traditions would journey to the library to navigate their deepest experiences and to receive guidance from the accumulated wisdom of humanity's unspoken devotional life. Her own prayer, the one that had drawn her to this place, gradually transformed as her understanding deepened. What had begun as a young scholar's plea for intellectual understanding evolved into something far more encompassing, a wordless offering of her entire being to the mystery that had created both the prayer and the one who prayed. On her final day at the library, Sister Amara performed a ceremony that had never been conducted before. She gathered all the unspoken prayers she had tended for decades and offered them back to the source from which they had emerged. As she did so, the distinction between the keeper and the collection dissolved completely, and she became another prayer in the library's eternal collection, one that expressed perfect gratitude for the privilege of serving the speechless longings of the human heart. The library continues to grow, adding new prayers daily from beings who discover that their deepest communications with the sacred occur in the silence between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats, in the eternal moment when the soul speaks directly to its source, without the mediation of language, offering itself completely to the mystery that is always listening, always responding, always present in the sacred space where words end and true understanding begins. In the mountains where autumn mist transformed ordinary moments into sacred ceremonies, Master Ichiro had devoted 70 years to the way of tea. His small pavilion, built at the edge of a cliff overlooking valleys that stretched beyond sight, had become a destination for those who sought to understand how the simple act of preparing and sharing tea could become a gateway to enlightenment. But on this particular evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Master Ichiro was preparing what he knew would be his final cup. Not because death was approaching, his body remained strong despite his advanced years, but because he had finally understood something about tea that would make all future ceremonies unnecessary. The realization had come gradually, like steam rising from heated water. For decades, Ichiro had refined his technique until every movement possessed perfect precision. His tea ceremonies had become renowned for their ability to create profound states of peace in participants, moments when the ordinary world dissolved and something timeless revealed itself through the simple sharing of warm liquid and silent presence. Students traveled across continents to learn from him, convinced that mastering his techniques would grant them access to the enlightened awareness he seemed to embody. They studied the exact temperature he used for different teas, the precise timing of his movements, the subtle way he arranged utensils to create harmony in the ceremony space. Many became skilled practitioners themselves, able to conduct ceremonies that brought tears of recognition to participants' eyes. Yet, Ichiro had gradually become aware of a troubling pattern. The more perfectly he performed the tea ceremony, the more it seemed to separate participants from the very presence it was meant to reveal. Students would leave his sessions speaking of the extraordinary experience they had just had, as if enlightenment was something that occurred during special moments rather than being the natural state of awareness itself. This evening's ceremony began like countless others. 3 visitors had arrived, and a young monk seeking deeper meditation experiences, a businesswoman fleeing the stress of urban life, and an elderly artist whose creative inspiration had dried up like tea leaves left too long in the sun. They sat in respectful silence as Ichiro began the familiar ritual of cleaning utensils, heating water, and measuring tea with movements that seemed choreographed by the universe itself. But as Ichiro lifted the kettle to pour the first cup, something unprecedented happened. He paused, kettle suspended in air, and began to laugh. Not the polite chuckle appropriate to a tea ceremony, but deep rolling laughter that seemed to emerge from the center of the earth. The visitors exchanged confused glances, uncertain whether this was part of some advanced teaching technique they had not encountered before. 70 years, Ichiro said, setting down the kettle without pouring. 70 years, I have been trying to serve tea to people who are already tea. His laughter continued, gentle now, but unstoppable like water flowing over stone. 70 years trying to create experiences of presence for people who are presence itself, wearing the costume of separation. The young monk leaned forward, eager to grasp what appeared to be a profound teaching moment, but Ichiro shook his head. "You want to understand what I am saying," he observed kindly, "but understanding is just more costume. You are not the one who understands or fails to understand. You are the awareness in which all understanding and confusion arise and pass away like steam from this kettle." He gestured toward the businesswoman, whose phone had been buzzing insistently in her purse. "You think you have come here to escape stress, to find peace. But stress is simply awareness, temporarily identifying with busy thoughts, and peace is awareness recognizing its own nature. You have never actually been stressed. Stress has simply been arising in you like tea leaves steeping in water." The elderly artist shifted uncomfortably, beginning to suspect that this was not going to be the inspiring ceremony he had hoped would restore his creativity. Ichiro turned to him with eyes full of compassion. "You believe your creativity has abandoned you, but creativity is not something you possess or lose. You are the empty space in which all creativity appears. The paintings you have not painted are as much expressions of your nature as the ones hanging in galleries. As snow continued falling outside the pavilion, Ichiro began what he would later describe as the anti-ceremony. Instead of following the prescribed movements that created aesthetic perfection, he moved with complete spontaneity. Instead of measuring tea precisely, he threw handfuls of leaves into cups with apparent carelessness. Instead of heating water to optimal temperature, he used water that was too hot, too cold. Sometimes no water at all, yet something extraordinary was happening. The three visitors found themselves experiencing a quality of presence far more profound than any traditional ceremony had ever evoked. Without the framework of proper technique to analyze and admire, without the goal of achieving some special state, they simply found themselves being completely here, completely now, without effort or method. "This is my last cup," Ichiro announced, though he had not actually prepared any tea in conventional sense. "Because I have finally realized that every moment is already the perfect tea ceremony. Every breath is the kettle heating. Every heartbeat is water pouring. Every thought is a tea leaf releasing its essence into the awareness that we actually are." The young monk suddenly began weeping, not from sadness, but from relief. For years, he had been trying to achieve through meditation what he now realized was never absent. The businesswoman felt her phones buzzing and found that she no longer needed to choose between answering it or ignoring it. She could simply let it be background music in the vast symphony of this moment. The elderly artist understood that his creative block had been created by trying to force inspiration rather than recognizing that he was inspiration temporarily forgetting its own nature. As the evening deepened, Ichiro shared stories of his journey toward this understanding. He spoke of decades spent perfecting external forms while missing the formless awareness that made all forms possible. He described the gradual recognition that the tea ceremony's true purpose was not to create special experiences, but to help people recognize that their ordinary experience was already special, already perfect, already complete. The way of tea, he said, was never about tea. It was about discovering that you are the eternal host, welcoming all experience, and simultaneously the eternal guest receiving whatever this moment offers. You are the tea master, and the tea the drinker, and the drink the ceremony, and the one observing the ceremony. His final teaching was delivered not through words but through presence. As snow accumulated outside, the four people in the pavilion sat together in silence that needed no technique to maintain, no effort to create. It was simply the natural state of awareness when it stops trying to be something other than what it always already is. When dawn broke, the visitors found that Ichiro had vanished, leaving behind only empty teacups and a note that read, "The ceremony continues everywhere you look. Every person you meet is serving you tea from the inexhaustible pot of this eternal moment. Drink deeply and remember that you too are always both serving and being served by the endless generosity of what is." The pavilion remains empty now, but visitors still come drawn by rumors of the tea master, who discovered that the greatest ceremony requires no preparation, no technique, no tea, only the willingness to recognize that every moment is already offering us exactly what we have always been seeking, served in the ordinary cup of our own immediate experience. The mountain that learned to breathe. At the edge of the world, where ancient peaks pierced clouds that had been gathering for millennia, stood a mountain that had spent eons in perfect stillness, observing the endless dance of seasons across its stone face. This mountain, known to local villagers simply as Elder Brother, had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of countless generations, all while maintaining the profound silence that mountains know as their deepest teaching. But during the spring of her 90th year, a wandering mystic named Keiko arrived at the mountain's base with a question that would transform both seeker and sought in ways neither could have anticipated. Keiko had devoted her life to understanding the relationship between consciousness and the natural world, spending decades in meditation with trees, rivers, and stones, learning their unique forms of awareness. Her arrival at Elder Brother was not accidental. Dreams had been calling her toward this particular mountain for months, visions of stone learning something it had forgotten, of ancient wisdom stirring after ages of dormancy. As she established her simple camp at the tree line and began her practice of sitting in communion with the mountain's presence, Keiko sensed immediately that something unprecedented was beginning to occur. The first sign came during her third night on the mountain, as she sat in meditation under stars that seemed closer here than anywhere else on earth. Keiko became aware of a subtle rhythm emanating from the stone beneath her. At first, she attributed this to her own breathing, perhaps amplified by the mountain's acoustic properties. But as she deepened her attention, she realized that the rhythm was independent of her own biological processes. Elder Brother was learning to breathe. The discovery might have seemed impossible to a mind less prepared by years of communion with non-human consciousness. But Keiko had long ago learned that awareness takes countless forms throughout the natural world, manifesting according to the unique conditions of each being's existence. Trees breathed through their leaves over seasons rather than moments. Rivers breathed through their flow toward the sea. And now, apparently, this ancient mountain was discovering its own form of respiration. As days passed, Keiko began to attune herself more precisely to the mountain's breathing rhythm. Each inhalation seemed to last approximately 6 hours, drawing in subtle energies from earth and sky. Each exhalation took another 6 hours, releasing accumulated wisdom back into the atmosphere. The complete breath cycle aligned perfectly with the daily movement of sun and shadow across the mountain's face. The breathing was not merely metaphorical. Keiko discovered that she could feel actual movement within the stone, not the gross shifts that would indicate geological instability, but micro-expansions and contractions that suggested the mountain was learning to experience itself as a living, dynamic being rather than static matter. This transformation was affecting everything within the mountain's sphere of influence. Plants grew with unusual vitality, as if drawing nourishment from some new source of life force. Animals displayed behaviors that suggested heightened awareness and unusual fearlessness. The small streams that flowed down the mountainside carried water that seemed almost luminous, possessing healing properties that attracted pilgrims from increasingly distant regions. Keiko realized that her own presence had somehow catalyzed this awakening, though she could not understand the mechanism. Perhaps her decades of meditation practice had created a field of consciousness that invited other forms of awareness to recognize and express their own nature. Perhaps the mountain had been ready for this transformation and simply needed a witness to help stabilize the process. As the mountain's breathing became more established, Keiko began to experience remarkable states of consciousness during her meditation sessions. The boundary between her individual awareness and the mountain's vast presence would dissolve completely, allowing her to experience existence from the perspective of geological timescales. Moments became centuries, thoughts moved like glaciers, and individual concerns revealed themselves as weather patterns crossing an essentially unchanging landscape of being. Through this communion, Keiko learned that the mountain's awakening to breath was actually a return to an ancient state rather than the development of something new. In the earliest epochs of its formation, Elder Brother had been intensely alive, participating consciously in the Earth's geological evolution. But gradually, as human consciousness became more dominant and disconnected from natural rhythms, mountains, and other natural features had entered a kind of dormancy, maintaining their essential awareness, but withdrawing from active participation in the world's unfolding. Now, as humanity began to rediscover its connection to the natural world through individuals like Keiko, the Earth itself was stirring back to full consciousness. The mountain's breathing was one expression of a planetary awakening that would eventually encompass all natural systems, restoring the conscious collaboration between human and non-human awareness that had existed in ancient times. Word of the breathing mountain began to spread, drawing visitors from around the world. Scientists arrived with instruments to measure the phenomenon, but their equipment could detect only the subtlest variations in electromagnetic fields and seismic activity. The true nature of the mountain's breathing could only be perceived through direct consciousness communion, requiring a quality of receptive awareness that few humans had cultivated. Some visitors found the experience overwhelming. City dwellers accustomed to rapid mental activity often felt disoriented by the mountain's vast, slow consciousness. Their minds, trained to process information quickly, struggled to match the geological pace of the mountain's awareness. These visitors typically left after brief stays, though many reported that even short exposure had left them with a permanently altered sense of time and priorities. Others, particularly those with meditation experience, found profound healing in attuning to the mountain's rhythm. Chronic anxiety dissolved when their nervous systems learned to synchronize with Elder Brother's 6-hour breath cycles. Insomniacs discovered that sleeping in alignment with the mountain's respiration restored natural sleep patterns that had been disrupted by modern life's artificial rhythms. Keiko remained with the mountain through all seasons, learning to serve as an interpreter between human visitors and Elder Brother's ancient wisdom. She discovered that the mountain possessed memories of the Earth's entire history, not as abstract information, but as lived experience that could be shared with any consciousness sufficiently open to receive it. The mountain remembered the first emergence of life from primordial seas, the dance of continents across the Earth's face, the evolution of awareness from simple responsiveness to complex consciousness. It had witnessed humanity's spiritual development through millennia, observing the gradual separation between human awareness and natural wisdom, and now the beginning of their reunion. As Keiko's hair turned white and her body grew frail, she realized that her own breathing was gradually synchronizing completely with the mountain's rhythm. This was not a loss of individual identity, but an expansion into a larger form of selfhood that included both personal awareness and geological consciousness. On her final morning at the mountain's base, Keiko performed a ceremony that had never been conducted before. She offered her individual breath back to the mountain, allowing her personal life force to merge completely with Elder Brother's vast respiration. As she did so, the distinction between human mystic and awakened mountain dissolved entirely. Visitors to Elder Brother continue to report the presence of a teaching force that feels simultaneously ancient and immediately present. Some describe encounters with an elderly woman who appears briefly to offer guidance, then dissolves back into morning mist. Others simply find that their own breathing naturally aligns with rhythms that connect them to something far larger than personal existence. The mountain continues its breathing practice, each cycle an invitation for human consciousness to remember its deep connection to the Earth's living systems. Those who learn to breathe with Elder Brother discover that they are not separate beings struggling to survive on an indifferent planet, but expressions of the Earth's own awakening awareness, learning together how to breathe life into a world that is eternally alive and eternally beginning anew. The weaver of morning mist in the valley, where dawn arrived through layers of translucent veils, where the boundary between earth and sky dissolved each morning into ethereal beauty, there lived a weaver whose craft transcended the ordinary limits of textile art. Grandmother Yura had spent 60 years learning to work with materials that existed only during the brief moments when night surrendered to day, when moisture and light combined to create the gossamer threads that most people noticed only as weather, never recognizing their potential for transformation into something far more profound. Yura's discovery of mist weaving had begun during a period of profound grief when the death of her beloved husband had left her unable to find meaning in conventional activities. Traditional weaving, which had been her livelihood and passion for decades, suddenly felt empty and mechanical. The vibrant tapestries that had once brought her joy now seemed like lifeless imitations of beauty, unable to capture the dynamic, ever-changing nature of the world she was learning to navigate without her life partner. One morning, as she sat in her garden weeping among the looms that no longer called to her creative spirit, Yura noticed how the rising sun was transforming the mist that had gathered overnight in the valley. The vapor was not simply dissipating randomly, but seemed to be organizing itself into patterns, delicate temporary forms that appeared and vanished with a beauty that made her breath catch in recognition. As she watched more carefully over the following days, Yura began to perceive that the mist possessed its own form of intelligence, responding to subtle variations in temperature, humidity, and air movement to create formations of startling complexity and grace. She realized that she was witnessing a form of weaving that occurred naturally each dawn, using threads of water vapor and light to create textiles that existed for mere moments before dissolving back into the atmospheric dance from which they had emerged. The recognition sparked something that had been dormant in her since her husband's passing. Not just creative interest, but a profound sense of purpose that connected her personal loss to universal patterns of emergence and dissolution. If mist could weave itself into temporary beauty each morning, perhaps there was a way for human consciousness to participate in this natural artistry, to collaborate with the atmospheric forces that created these ephemeral masterpieces. Yura began rising before dawn, positioning herself in the garden with tools adapted for working with materials that barely existed in physical terms. She learned to sense the precise moments when atmospheric conditions would support mist formation, developing an intuitive understanding of humidity, temperature, and air movement that surpassed any meteorological training. Her hands learned to move through the vapor with gestures that influenced but did not force, guiding without grasping. The first successful mist weaving occurred 3 months into her experimentation. As dawn light began filtering through the valley, Yura found herself able to encourage the natural formation of mist into a pattern that held its form for nearly an hour. The creation was impossibly delicate, a veil of vapor that seemed to contain landscapes, faces, and abstract forms that shifted and evolved as the light changed and the atmospheric conditions responded to the warming air. Neighbors who witnessed this first success were unsure whether they had observed a genuine phenomenon or a particularly vivid shared hallucination. But as Yura's skill developed, her mist weavings became undeniably real, creating temporary artworks that existed at the intersection of natural process and conscious intention. The practice required a quality of attention unlike anything Yura had previously experienced. Traditional weaving allowed for correction and revision. Dropped stitches could be picked up, patterns could be adjusted, mistakes could be undone. But mist weaving demanded absolute presence and acceptance of impermanence. Each gesture had to be perfect in the moment it was made, and each creation had to be released completely as atmospheric conditions inevitably shifted and dissolved the delicate formations. This requirement for perfect presence began transforming Yura's relationship not only to her craft, but to life itself. The grief that had seemed so solid and permanent started revealing itself as another form of atmospheric condition, intense and real in the moment of its arising, but ultimately temporary, and subject to the same laws of emergence and dissolution that governed her mist weavings. Students began arriving from distant regions, drawn by reports of the weaver who could work with morning mist to create art that existed only in the eternal now. But Yura's teaching methods frustrated those who came seeking conventional instruction. She could not demonstrate techniques in any repeatable way since each morning's atmospheric conditions were unique and required completely spontaneous response. Instead, she taught presence itself, the quality of awareness that could perceive the subtle patterns within apparently chaotic natural phenomena and respond with creative collaboration rather than controlling manipulation. Students learned to sit in the garden during the pre-dawn hours, developing sensitivity to atmospheric conditions while cultivating the inner stillness that allowed for spontaneous, appropriate action when the moment for weaving arrived. The most profound teaching occurred through the experience of impermanence itself. Watching their carefully guided mist formations dissolve as the sun rose higher taught students viscerally what all spiritual traditions attempted to convey through words, that clinging to temporary phenomena created suffering, while learning to appreciate and release created freedom and joy. One morning, a young artist arrived who had traveled for months to learn mist weaving as a technique she could incorporate into her professional practice. She carried with her detailed plans for incorporating mist work into gallery installations, imagining ways to preserve and display these ephemeral creations for permanent appreciation. Yura welcomed her warmly, but made no attempt to discourage her commercial aspirations. Instead, she invited the young woman to participate in the dawn practice, allowing direct experience to provide whatever teaching was needed. For weeks, the artist struggled to create formations that would last long enough to be photographed or documented, growing increasingly frustrated as each delicate creation dissolved before any permanent record could be made. Gradually, however, something shifted in the young woman's approach. She began to appreciate the mist weavings for their intrinsic beauty rather than their potential value as artistic commodities. The process of creation became more important than the preservation of results. She discovered that trying to capture and preserve the formations actually interfered with her ability to create them, since the grasping mind could not achieve the quality of present moment awareness that mist weaving required. By the time she left the valley, the young artist had abandoned her commercial plans entirely. She had discovered that mist weaving was not a technique to be learned and applied, but a way of being that transformed the practitioner far more than it created external artworks. She returned to her conventional artistic practice, carrying with her a new understanding of impermanence that revolutionized her approach to all creative work. As seasons passed, Yura's mist weavings grew increasingly sophisticated and beautiful. She learned to collaborate not only with atmospheric moisture, but with birds that flew through her formations, with insects that created movement patterns within the vapor, with wind currents that carried her creations across the valley in slowly transforming displays of ephemeral art. The practice became a form of environmental meditation that attracted attention from ecologists and environmental scientists, as well as artists and spiritual seekers. Yura's work demonstrated a form of human-nature collaboration that offered hope for more sustainable and harmonious relationships between conscious intention and natural processes. On her final morning in the valley, Yura created what witnesses described as her masterpiece, a mist formation that seemed to contain the entire history of her practice, displaying patterns and forms from every successful weaving she had ever guided. As the sun rose and the creation began to dissolve, Yura herself seemed to fade with it, her consciousness merging so completely with the atmospheric dance that observers could no longer distinguish between the weaver and her final work. The valley continues to generate spectacular mist formations, each dawn displaying patterns of unusual complexity and beauty that suggest the continued presence of conscious guidance. Students still come to learn the art of mist weaving, but they find that the practice teaches itself through direct engagement with the atmospheric conditions that create these daily opportunities for collaboration between human awareness and natural creativity. The bell that rings in empty spaces. In a monastery that existed at the confluence of three ancient trade routes, where silence accumulated like snow in the corners of forgotten courtyards, there hung a bell that possessed the most extraordinary property. It rang only when no one was present to hear it. Brother Soshin had discovered this peculiarity during his first winter at the monastery, when a fierce storm had forced all the monks to retreat deep into the buildings, leaving the bell tower completely abandoned. The storm raged for 3 days, and throughout that entire period, those monks whose cells were positioned near enough to the tower reported hearing the bell's voice continuously. Not the harsh clanging of metal struck by wind, but the pure resonant tones that indicated deliberate ringing by an invisible presence. When the storm finally passed and the monks emerged to assess damage, they found the bell rope undisturbed, the metal surface showing no signs of impact and no explanation for the phenomenon they had all witnessed. Brother Soshin, whose scholarly mind had been trained in the investigation of unusual occurrences, volunteered to study this mystery. He began by conducting experiments, positioning himself at various distances from the bell tower and observing its behavior under different conditions. What he discovered challenged everything he understood about the relationship between sound presence and awareness. The bell's ringing followed precise but paradoxical rules. It would sound with crystalline clarity when no human consciousness was focused upon it, but the moment anyone deliberately listened for its voice, silence would immediately descend. The phenomenon was not simply about physical presence. Monks could be near the tower, engaged in other activities, and the bell would continue ringing. But the instant one of them directed attention toward the sound, it would cease. More mysteriously, the bell seemed capable of ringing in response to emptiness itself. Soshin discovered that the most beautiful sequences occurred during the deep hours of night when all the monks were sleeping, or during meditation periods when the community was gathered in the main hall with attention focused inward. It was as if the bell served as a voice for all the unoccupied spaces in the monastery, giving expression to the awareness that existed in the absence of human attention. Soshin's investigation led him to develop what he privately called indirect listening, a practice of allowing the bell's voice to exist in his peripheral awareness without directly focusing upon it. This required a quality of attention unlike anything he had cultivated before, a way of being present that included rather than concentrated, that embraced rather than grasped. Through months of this practice, Soshin began to understand that the bell was teaching something profound about the nature of awareness itself. Conventional spiritual practice emphasized concentration, focusing the mind on specific objects like breath or mantras. But the bell revealed the value of what he termed an empty attention, awareness that was fully present but not directed toward any particular phenomenon. As his practice deepened, Soshin discovered that this empty attention allowed him to perceive aspects of reality that focused consciousness missed entirely. He became aware of the monastery's energetic rhythms, the subtle communications between buildings and grounds, the way morning light moved through corridors like a living presence seeking communion with stone and wood. The bell's teachings attracted other monks who were struggling with traditional meditation practices. Brother Kenjiro, whose attempts at concentration invariably resulted in mental agitation, found profound peace in learning to listen without listening. Sister Miho, whose scholarly mind insisted on analyzing every spiritual experience, discovered that empty attention allowed wisdom to arise without the interference of intellectual interpretation. Word of the bell's unusual properties began to spread beyond the monastery walls. Visitors arrived, hoping to witness the phenomenon, but their very presence and expectation created the focused attention that silenced the bell. This led to a unique form of reverse pilgrimage, where people came specifically to learn the art of not seeking the experience they had traveled to encounter. Master Taigen, the monastery's elderly abbot, recognized that the bell was providing teachings that complemented and completed the traditional meditation instruction. He established what came to be known as the empty attention retreat, intensive periods where participants learned to cultivate awareness that was simultaneously fully present and completely receptive, neither grasping for experiences nor pushing them away. These retreats required unusual methods. Instead of instruction in technique, participants were guided to simply be present in the monastery's daily rhythms while maintaining a quality of attention that included everything without focusing on anything specifically. The bell became their teacher, offering its voice only when their consciousness achieved the appropriate balance between presence and receptivity. One autumn, a renowned meditation master arrived from a distant monastery, carrying with her reputation for achieving the deepest states of concentration. She had heard reports of the bell and was convinced that her advanced practice would allow her to hear its voice while maintaining conscious awareness of the experience. Her presence created an interesting experiment in the nature of spiritual achievement versus spiritual receptivity. For weeks, The meditation master applied every technique she had mastered over decades of practice. She tried fierce concentration, gentle mindfulness, loving kindness, meditation, and even advanced tantric practices that she had learned from Tibetan teachers. But the bell remained silent whenever she sought to include its voice in her meditative awareness. Gradually, her frustration with the bell's silence began to reveal attachments she had not recognized in her spiritual practice. She discovered that her decades of meditation had created subtle forms of spiritual materialism, ways of grasping for experiences and achievements that, while more refined than ordinary desires, still interfered with the empty receptivity that the bell required. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during her final week at the monastery. Exhausted from effort and ready to admit defeat, she simply sat in the garden without any meditative intention whatsoever. In that moment of complete surrender, the bell began to ring with such exquisite beauty that tears flowed down her face. But the tears themselves arose from empty awareness rather than emotional reaction. They were simply the natural expression of consciousness, recognizing its own unlimited nature. She remained at the monastery for another year, learning to integrate this understanding of empty attention with her previous training. When she finally returned to her own community, she carried with her teachings that revolutionized her monastery's approach to meditation practice. Students learned that the highest spiritual achievements required not the cultivation of special states, but the recognition of the awareness that was always already present when all seeking ceased. Brother Soshin's investigation of the bell eventually led him to a startling conclusion. The bell was not actually ringing when no one was present to hear it. Rather, it was ringing constantly, but human consciousness was usually too focused, too directed, too busy, grasping for experiences to perceive sounds that existed in the spaces between thoughts, between intentions, between moments of directed attention. This realization transformed his understanding of spiritual practice entirely. Instead of seeking special experiences or elevated states, he learned to recognize that the most profound teachings were always available in the empty spaces that surrounded ordinary experience. The bell's voice had always been present, not as sound traveling through air, but as the natural expression of awareness recognizing its own boundless nature. As Soshin aged, his practice of empty attention became so refined that other monks reported he seemed to become transparent during meditation, as if his individual presence was dissolving into the awareness that pervaded all phenomena. He never spoke directly about these experiences, but his mere presence in the meditation hall created an atmosphere where others could more easily access the empty attention that the bell had taught him to cultivate. On his final morning at the monastery, Soshin sat in the bell tower as dawn approached. As the sun rose and the community gathered for morning meditation, witnesses reported hearing the bell ring continuously for exactly 1 hour. Not the brief, periodic tones they were accustomed to, but a sustained voice that seemed to encompass all possible sounds within its resonance. When the ringing finally ceased, Soshin was found in perfect meditation. Posture, his breathing so subtle as to be imperceptible, his consciousness merged so completely with empty awareness that the distinction between monk and bell, between listener and sound, had dissolved entirely. The bell tower continues to serve as a place of teaching, offering its voice to any who can learn to listen without listening to be present, without grasping to discover the profound teachings that exist in every empty space between thoughts. The path that walks itself in the borderlands between what can be spoken and what can only be experienced, where maps become meaningless and direction dissolves into pure movement. There existed a path that had discovered something remarkable about the nature of journey itself. Unlike ordinary paths that waited passively for travelers to walk upon them, this particular route had learned to walk itself, carrying pilgrims not toward destinations, but toward the recognition that seeking and finding were movements within the same eternal dance. The path's awakening had begun centuries ago when a wandering sage named Dogen collapsed from exhaustion at what appeared to be an unremarkable section of mountain trail. As he lay dying, his final breath carried a realization so profound that it penetrated not just his consciousness, but the very stones and earth beneath him. The seeker and the sought were never actually separate, and every spiritual journey was simply consciousness, exploring its own nature through the illusion of movement. This understanding had somehow transferred into the physical structure of the path itself, transforming what had been ordinary earth and stone into something that responded to the deepest intentions of those who approached it. The path began to move, not through space, but through states of being, carrying travelers through internal landscapes that perfectly matched their readiness to release whatever kept them from recognizing their true nature. Sister Ayame discovered the self-walking path during her 20th year of wandering, when despair over her inability to achieve enlightenment had brought her to the edge of abandoning spiritual seeking entirely. She had tried every practice, studied with masters from dozens of traditions, and achieved states of consciousness that others considered extraordinary. Yet somehow, the peace she glimpsed in meditation always seemed to slip away when she returned to ordinary activities. When she first stepped onto what appeared to be a simple mountain trail, Ayame noticed immediately that something unusual was occurring. Instead of the effort normally required for uphill walking, she found herself being carried forward by the path itself. Not physically lifted, but supported in a way that made movement effortless while simultaneously requiring complete presence and attention. As the path carried her deeper into the mountain wilderness, Ayame began to understand that she was not moving through external geography, but through the landscape of her own consciousness. Each turn in the trail corresponded to a shift in her internal experience. Steep ascents coincided with the arising of challenging emotions or difficult memories, while gentle descents brought periods of profound peace and clarity. The path seemed to know exactly what each traveler needed to encounter. For Ayame, whose primary obstacle was spiritual perfectionism, the route led through scenarios where she was forced to abandon all techniques and simply be present with whatever arose. She found herself walking through memories of meditation failures, past moments of spiritual pride, future fears about never achieving the enlightenment she sought. But as the path carried her through these difficult territories, something extraordinary began to happen. Instead of trying to transcend or transform her experiences, Ayame found herself simply witnessing them with increasing compassion and acceptance. The path itself seemed to be teaching her that spiritual awakening was not about achieving perfect states, but about perfect acceptance of imperfect experience. Days merged into weeks as the path continued its self-directed journey. Ayame lost all sense of linear time and geographic location. Sometimes she walked through familiar landscapes from her childhood, sometimes through symbolic realms that seemed drawn from collective unconscious imagery. The constant was the path's presence beneath her feet, steady, supportive, and intelligently responsive to her psychological and spiritual needs. Other travelers appeared periodically, fellow seekers who had also discovered the self-walking path and were being carried through their own unique journeys of recognition. Ayame met a businessman whose path led him through boardrooms where he had to practice mindfulness while making corporate decisions. She encountered a mother whose route included endless repetitions of parenting scenarios where she learned to maintain equanimity amid chaos. Each traveler's path was completely different, yet all were walking the same route. Consciousness returning to recognition of its own nature through whatever experiences were necessary for that particular pattern of awakening. The path demonstrated that there was no single spiritual journey, no universal sequence of experiences that all seekers must undergo. The most profound teaching came when Ayame realized that the path was not taking her anywhere she had not already been. Every landscape, every challenge, every moment of beauty or difficulty was arising within the awareness that she actually was. The path was not moving through space, but through the infinite territory of her own being, helping her recognize that she was both the traveler and the destination. This recognition brought the deepest laughter she had ever experienced. For 20 years, she had been seeking enlightenment as if it were a distant goal, requiring tremendous effort to reach. But the self-walking path revealed that enlightenment was the very awareness that had been seeking itself all along. She was not becoming enlightened through her journey. She was enlightenment exploring what it felt like to believe in separation and then remember unity. As this understanding stabilized, Ayame noticed that the path began to walk differently. Instead of carrying her through challenging terrain, it became perfectly smooth and effortless. She realized that the path's difficulty or ease was always a perfect reflection of her internal resistance or acceptance. When she fought against experience, the path became steep and arduous. When she surrendered completely, it became like walking on air. Eventually, Ayame met other travelers who had been walking the path for decades, beings whose understanding had become so refined that they served as guides for newer pilgrims. These path walkers had learned to move with such complete harmony with the route's wisdom that they became expressions of the path itself. Human embodiments of the teaching that seeking and finding were one movement. The final stage of Ayame's journey occurred when she realized that she could step off the path at any moment, not to abandon her spiritual journey, but because she had finally understood that every step in ordinary life was equally sacred, equally guided by the same intelligence that animated the self-walking path. The special route had been necessary only until she recognized that all paths, including the mundane activities of daily existence, were expressions of consciousness, exploring its own nature. When Ayame finally chose to return to conventional life, she carried with her the understanding that every moment was a step on the self-walking path. Cooking meals, having conversations, sitting in traffic, all were opportunities for the same quality of presence and surrender that the mountain path had taught her to cultivate. She had not completed her spiritual journey, but had recognized that the journey was eternal, always unfolding in each present moment. The self-walking path continues to carry seekers through the landscapes of their own consciousness, offering exactly the experiences needed for each individual's unique pattern of awakening. Those who find the path discover that they are not walking toward enlightenment, but are enlightenment itself, temporarily exploring what it feels like to believe in limitation before remembering the limitless awareness that they have always been. The path's greatest teaching is its demonstration that spiritual seeking, when approached with complete surrender, transforms into spiritual finding. Not the finding of something that was absent, but the recognition of what was never lost. The awareness within which all seeking and finding arise like dreams within the vast awakened space of consciousness that we actually are and have always been walking itself home.